You seem to have me confused with someone who will be denied." Those words had not been spoken yet, but Naomi Reeves had been preparing to say something like them for the better part of 44 years, and on this particular Tuesday morning, standing at the window of a perfectly ordinary hotel room on the 14th floor of a perfectly ordinary Chicago hotel, watching the city below begin its slow gray awakening, she felt the particular stillness that comes before something important, the way the air changes before a storm, not threatening exactly, but charged as if the atmosphere itself knows what is coming, even when the people in it do not. The room was a standard king booked under her own name through the same corporate travel portal that every mid-level Valor Airways manager used, because that was the point, that was precisely and deliberately the point. And if anyone in the building behind her, the gleaming tower of Valor's Chicago headquarters 20 blocks north, had thought to look at the travel logs, and noticed that the new chief executive officer had checked into a $189 a night airport-adjacent hotel instead of the executive suite at the Four Seasons, they might have understood something important about who they had hired, and they might have been either reassured or terrified, and both reactions would have been appropriate. Naomi had been CEO of Valor Airways for 68 hours. She had not yet been to headquarters. She had not issued a press release, attended a town hall, or introduced herself to the leadership team in any formal capacity. What she had done in those 68 hours was read. She had read the board's 112-slide presentation on Valor's operational failures until the slides lost their meaning and became just numbers swimming in corporate blue and white. She had read 3 years of customer complaint reports, which she had requested through a paralegal contact, so the request would not be traceable to the executive suite. She had read the last 4 employee engagement surveys, the kind of documents that companies commission and then quietly shelve because the results are too uncomfortable to act on. What she had learned from the reading was this: Valor Airways was not simply losing money, though it was losing money steadily, and with the particular momentum of a thing that has been falling long enough to believe falling is its natural state. Valor was losing something harder to quantify and far more expensive to recover. It was losing the trust of the people who flew it and the people who worked for it, and those two losses were not separate problems, but the same problem wearing different clothes. The board had hired her to cut costs, restructure routes, and modernize the fleet financing. She had told them in the second meeting that she would do all of those things, but that she needed to see the airline from the inside first, not from a briefing room, not from a data dashboard, but from a seat, a real seat on a real flight with real passengers around her who had no idea who she was. The board chairman, a man named Robert Ashby, who wore his old money with the ease of someone who had never needed to think about it, had looked at her with the particular expression that men like him reserve for ideas they find eccentric but cannot actually argue with, and he had said fine, but be discreet. She had smiled at him and said nothing because discretion was not the goal. Honesty was, and those two things are not always the same. On the desk behind her, 3 audit binders, dense with operational data, a laptop open to Valor's route performance dashboard, and a printed boarding pass for flight 208 Chicago, O'Hare to London Gatwick, departing at 7:15 a.m. business class seat 14C purchased on her personal Visa card for $2,340 to be reimbursed after the trip through a standard expense report that would look to anyone auditing it exactly like what it was. She was wearing a simple navy pantsuit, the kind that reads as professional, without reading as powerful, and her hair was pulled back in a clean bun that her mother would have approved of her mother, who believed that the way you presented yourself to the world was a form of respect both given and demanded. On her left wrist, a thin gold watch, the band worn smooth from 20 years of daily use because it had been on her mother's wrist for 20 years before that, and the smoothness was not wear, but history, and Naomi wore it on every day that mattered. She picked up the cold coffee, drank the last of it, picked up her carry-on one-bag laptop binders, a spare blouse, and stepped out the door into the corridor where the carpet was a shade of beige that belonged to no particular decade, and the overhead lights hummed with the low-grade fatigue of fixtures that had been on for too long. She was going to see what her airline looked like from the inside. She was not prepared for how quickly the inside would come to see her. O'Hare at 6:45 in the morning has a particular quality of light that is neither night nor day, but something suspended between the two. The fluorescent overhead glow fighting against the pale gray coming through the terminal windows. The effect being that everyone inside looks slightly unreal, slightly tired, slightly like a version of themselves from a dream that is not quite over yet. And Naomi moved through it with the practiced, unhurried attention of someone who has learned that the most important things in any environment are not the things that announce themselves, but the things that quietly reveal themselves to anyone patient enough to look. She did not look like someone taking notes. She looked like a business traveler who had done this enough times that the airport had stopped interesting her, which was the exact impression she wanted to create because the most honest version of any operation is the version that believes it is not being watched. At the premium check-in lane near Terminal H, she stopped for a moment and observed the Valor kiosk on the left had a cracked screen along the bottom. Third, a crack that was not new. The edges had the particular grayness of something that has been broken long enough to be accepted as part of the landscape, and a small printed sign taped above the touchpad read, "Please use agent for assistance," in a font that suggested the sign had been there longer than the crack. She wrote in her notebook, "Premium check-in kiosk H3 screen damage, unaddressed, unknown duration." Directs to agent. Agent Q11 passengers, 1 agent on duty. She did not write it with anger. She wrote it the way a doctor writes a diagnosis, not as a judgment of the patient, but as a record of what the patient cannot yet see about themselves. At gate K7, she arrived at 7:02 and took a seat near the windows, one row back from the gate podium, angled so she could see both the agents and the waiting passengers without being the obvious observer in the room. The gate area was crowded in the particular way of an international morning departure. Families with too much luggage arranged anxiously around their carry-ons. Road warriors in noise-canceling headphones who had done this so many times. The ritual had become muscle memory tourists with the bright and slightly stunned energy of people who are still amazed that air travel is real and available to them. The digital board above the gate read, "Valor 208. London Gatwick delayed 25 minutes. No announcement had been made. No agent had approached the microphone. The passengers near the podium had the particular restless quality of people who know something has changed but have not yet been told, and the not being told is somehow worse than the thing itself. There were 2 gate agents. The younger one, her name tag read. Priya was fielding questions from 3 passengers simultaneously, her hands moving between her keyboard and her radio with the efficiency of someone running on adrenaline and goodwill. Her face maintaining a professional composure that Naomi recognized as the expression of a person doing their absolute best in conditions that are not their fault. The older agent had retreated to the back office and had not re-emerged in the 7 minutes since Naomi sat down. She wrote, K7 delay 25 minutes. No PA announcement. Passenger sentiment declining. Single agent managing floor. Staffing failure, not individual failure. Then the flight crew arrived. They came through the concourse with the particular walk of people who know the crowd will part for them. And the crowd did part, not because anyone consciously decided to, but because the 4 gold stripes on the pilot's jacket and the general air of ownership that surrounded him created an unconscious magnetic effect. A slight widening of the path that Naomi had observed in airports her entire career and had never quite stopped noticing. Captain Derek Whitmore was somewhere in his late 50s with silver blonde hair gone mostly silver at the temples, but still pale enough at the crown to catch the overhead light in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though even his appearance had been arranged to project authority. He was broad-shouldered, well over 6 feet, and he moved through Gate K7 the way a landlord moves through a property he has owned so long he has forgotten that other people have to live in it. He stopped briefly to straighten a Valor promotional poster on the pillar near the jet bridge door. A small proprietary gesture, the kind you make with things you consider yours, and then said something to his co-pilot, a younger man named First Officer Ray Salinas, that made him laugh, and neither of them looked at the passengers or at Priya, who was still managing 3 conversations at once 12 feet away. Naomi watched Whitmore cross to the gate podium, where Priya looked up from her screen with the instinctive alertness of someone who has learned that when the captain arrives, things can go either better or worse depending entirely on his mood. Whitmore said something to her without making eye contact, not a greeting, not a question, just an instruction of some kind. And Priya nodded and visibly shrank, just a fraction, just enough for someone paying attention to see it, and then Whitmore walked away toward the jet bridge door without waiting for a response. Naomi wrote one line, "Command Crew 0 integration with gate staff. Priya visible deference under pressure. Pattern not incident." She closed her notebook. Boarding was 7 minutes away. She looked out the window at the 777 sitting at the gate, its Valor livery bright in the early morning light, pale blue and white, with the small winged logo on the tail that someone in a design meeting had once called aspirational. And she thought, this is my plane, and the people who work on it and in it and around it do not yet know that. And everything that happens in the next hour will be the truest possible answer to the question of what I've inherited. She thought about her mother's watch. She thought about the word aspirational. She thought about the gap between what a thing claims to be and what it actually is, and how that gap in companies, as in people, is always the most important distance in the room. Priya Anand had been at Gate K7 since 5:28 a.m., which was 7 minutes earlier than her scheduled start time, because she had learned in 3 years of working Valor's Chicago hub that arriving on time for an international departure meant arriving already behind, and she had developed the habit of giving herself those extra 7 minutes as a kind of buffer against the particular chaos that early morning flights carry with them like weather. Her co-agent, a man named Doug, who was technically the senior agent on the K7 rotation, and who had 15 years of experience that he deployed with the careful economy of someone who had long ago decided how much effort was appropriate and had not revisited the calculation since, had called in sick at 4:47 a.m., which Priya had discovered when she arrived at the gate and found his station dark and his coffee still in the machine from the day before. She had sent 3 messages to her floor supervisor, Marcus Webb. No relation to the VP, just an unfortunate coincidence of surname that occasionally caused confusion in the internal email system requesting backup coverage. The first message had been sent at 5:31 a.m., the second at 5:52. The third, which had contained the phrase, "The flight is already showing a delay, and I am the only agent on the floor," in language that was professional but pointed at 6:15. None of them had received a response. Not a reply, not an acknowledgement, not the small electronic signal of someone having read the message and chosen to deal with it later. Priya had dealt with this before. She had dealt with it so many times, in fact, that she had stopped being surprised by it and had simply incorporated it into her operational calculations the way you incorporate bad weather, not something to be angry at, just something to work around. The flight delay had been confirmed at 6:03, a 25-minute push, due to a late arriving aircraft on the inbound leg, and Priya had made one PA announcement at 6:08 that had been partially swallowed by the distortion in the K7 PA system. A distortion that had been reported twice to facilities management and was listed as under review in the maintenance queue, which was where things in Valor's maintenance queue tended to stay. 3 passengers had come to the desk afterward to ask what the announcement had said. She had told them individually. She had then answered 14 other questions in the following 40 minutes from passengers who had varying degrees of urgency and varying degrees of patience, and all of whom were entirely reasonable people having a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. She noticed Captain Whitmore arrive. She always noticed when he arrived because in the 6 departures she had managed for his flights over the past 2 months, his arrival had never once made her day easier. He spoke to her briefly this morning, told her boarding would begin at 7:10, regardless of whether the earlier delay had fully resolved, which was technically his prerogative as pilot in command and practically a way of ensuring that whatever was not ready at 7:10 would become her problem rather than his, and then walked away before she could respond. She had also noticed the woman in the navy pantsuit sitting alone near the window, writing steadily in a small notebook, and looking at the gate with the particular quality of attention that Priya associated with people who understood what they were seeing, and something about that attention. Calm, unperformed, genuinely seeing, had made Priya feel for just a moment slightly less alone in the room. Then the boarding call went out, and the moment passed, and she picked up the scanner and put on the face she wore for these next 30 minutes, the one that said, "Everything is fine. I have this. Please trust me." And for the most part, when she wore that face, people did. The boarding process for Flight 208 began at 7:09 a.m., with the pre-board call families with young children, passengers requiring additional assistance, Valor status members who had accumulated enough miles to earn the small dignity of boarding first, and Priya managed it alone, moving between the scanner and the podium microphone with the particular efficient grace of someone who has done a difficult thing enough times to make it look easy, even when it isn't, which is its own kind of skill, undervalued and invisible in the way that most essential things are. The cabin and business class call came at 7:14. Naomi stood, straightened her jacket, and joined the short queue. She was third behind a man in a tailored gray suit, who moved with the automatic efficiency of someone who had taken this flight so many times it had become an extension of his office, and a woman with a carry-on that cost more than Priya's monthly salary, who was already on her phone and remained on her phone through the entire boarding process, in the way of someone who has decided that the transaction of boarding a plane does not require her full presence. The first 2 passengers were scanned through without event, and then it was Naomi's turn, and she stepped forward with her phone extended. The boarding pass displayed clearly on the screen and offered Priya a small professional smile. Not warm, exactly. Not the performed warmth of someone trying to create goodwill. Just the acknowledgement of one person to another that they are both here, both doing their jobs, and that this moment between them deserves the basic courtesy of being seen. Priya reached for the scanner, and then the hand came down. It was a large hand, the kind that comes from decades of gripping things, yokes and handshakes, and steering wheels and apparently scanner terminals at gate podiums, and it landed flat on the scanner housing with a sound that was not loud but was definitive, the sound of someone who is accustomed to his physical presence settling questions without argument. Captain Derek Whitmore had stepped out of the jet bridge doorway and placed himself with the unhurried confidence of a man exercising a right he has never had to justify directly in the boarding line between a paying passenger and her seat. His eyes moved over Naomi the way a customs officer's eyes move over a piece of luggage that doesn't look right, slow, comprehensive landing on things and departing from them with a particular pointed quality that was not professional assessment, but something older and less defensible than that something that had been living comfortably inside certain institutions for so long that the people who carried it had stopped recognizing it as a choice. He took in her dark skin, her simple suit, the way she was holding her phone, which was the way any business class passenger holds their phone when they are presenting their boarding pass calmly and with the expectation of being processed. And something in his expression settled into a configuration that Naomi had seen before in boardrooms and conference calls, and the occasional airport a configuration that said, "This doesn't fit, and I am the person who decides what fits." The line behind Naomi went still. She was aware in her peripheral vision of phones beginning to emerge from pockets and bags held low, but angled the way phones are held when people want to record something without appearing to record it. 3 places back in the economy queue, a man named James Okafor shifted the strap of his camera bag from his right shoulder to his left, and the lens cap very quietly came off. Whitmore's opening position was not aggression. It was something more insidious than aggression, because aggression can be named and addressed and defended against, while what Whitmore deployed in the first 30 seconds was the particular weaponized politeness of a man who has learned over decades of institutional impunity that the most effective way to do damage is to do it while maintaining the performance of reasonableness, so that when the damage is done, he can point to the performance and say, "I was simply doing my job." He told Priya without looking at Naomi that boarding was paused pending a verification concern in the premium cabin. He used the word verification the way someone uses a technical term they know their audience won't challenge with the quiet authority of a specialist, informing a layperson that there is a complexity here that exceeds their understanding. Naomi looked at him and stated her name, her seat number. The fact that her identification and her boarding pass were the same document she had used to check in 2 hours earlier at the premium counter, where they had been verified without incident, and that she was ready to board. Whitmore's response was to suggest in a tone that was almost collegial, almost conversational, almost the tone of a man raising a perfectly reasonable procedural concern between reasonable professionals, that there had been a significant increase in boarding pass fraud on premium international routes recently, and that the airline took these matters seriously, and that he hoped she would understand why a brief additional verification might be necessary. The word fraud entered the gate area like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples were immediate and visible. Heads turned, conversation stopped mid-sentence. The man in the gray suit ahead of her in the queue looked back with the careful blankness of someone who has registered something unpleasant and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. Naomi did not react to the word. She held Whitmore's gaze with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who has been in this particular room many times before, and she said her credentials matched her seat was confirmed in the system, and she was ready to board. Whitmore turned to Priya and told her to call security, because the passenger was being disruptive and he needed the situation managed. Priya's internal collapse happened in the space of approximately 1 second, visible in the slight forward movement of her shoulders, the way her eyes moved from Whitmore to Naomi, and back again with the particular desperate calculation of someone trying to find a third option in a situation that is presenting itself as binary, and the terrible clarity with which she understood that the boarding pass on Naomi's phone was valid. She had already scanned it. The system had already confirmed it. She knew this with absolute certainty. And none of that knowledge was powerful enough to compete with the fact that Captain Derek Whitmore, pilot in command of a $250 million aircraft, was standing in front of her, telling her to do something else. First Officer Ray Salinas had been standing to the side of the jet bridge door, watching the confrontation with the expression of a man who is hoping very hard that the thing he is witnessing will resolve itself before it requires him to do something difficult. And when it became clear that it was not going to resolve itself, he took a breath and stepped forward and said quietly and carefully that the boarding pass appeared to be valid, that they were already running behind schedule, and that perhaps they should simply board the passenger and get the flight moving. Whitmore turned to face him with the particular cold attention of someone who has just been publicly challenged by a person they have spent years ensuring will never challenge them, and he said loudly enough for the people nearest the gate to hear clearly that co-pilots fly when captains tell them to fly, and they do not question the decisions of the pilot in command, and that Salinas had 7 years of experience as a first officer, and he should apply those 7 years to understanding the appropriate scope of his authority and keeping himself within it. Salinas's face went through several things in rapid succession: anger and humiliation, and a very specific kind of defeat that belongs to people who have learned through repeated experience that doing the right thing in certain institutional environments carries a cost that doing the wrong thing does not. And he stepped back and he said nothing more, and his face settled into the careful blankness of a man who has made his attempt and been reminded of his place. Naomi noted the interaction with the precise, unsentimental attention she had been applying to everything since she sat down at the gate at 7:02 a.m. She wrote nothing she was not writing. Now she was simply filing, cataloging, building a record in the only storage medium that mattered in this moment, which was her own memory, which had never failed her in 44 years of accumulating exactly this kind of information. James Okafor, 3 places back in the economy queue, had stopped pretending to look at his phone and was now watching the confrontation with the open, steady attention of a man who has spent his professional life documenting moments that the people creating them believe will go unwitnessed. And he had angled his camera bag so that the lens, a wide-angle prime with a fast aperture, the kind that performs in low light without needing to announce itself, was pointed directly at the gate podium. Behind him, without coordination, without discussion, simply because human beings in the presence of injustice have a collective instinct that predates all the institutions we have built to manage it, 3 more phones had been raised. The boarding line had stopped the way traffic stops on a highway when something has happened ahead that no one can yet see, but everyone can feel a collective deceleration, a narrowing of attention, a reorganization of the space around the incident that made the incident the center of gravity for everyone within range of it. And the passengers of Flight 208 were now, whether they wanted to be or not, participants in something that had not yet finished happening. Naomi was aware of the phones. She did not play to them, did not turn toward them or acknowledge them in any way that would suggest she was performing, rather than simply standing in the boarding line with a valid ticket. Because she was not performing, she was simply standing there. And the recording of what she was simply doing was, she understood, potentially the most important document produced at Gate K7 that morning. She asked Whitmore in the clear, precise voice she had used in every boardroom and arbitration and public forum where her words needed to carry exactly as far as she intended, and no further, to state his official reason for denying her boarding, to state it on the record for the benefit of the Valor Airways operational log, which required documentation of any incident in which a captain exercised his authority to deny boarding to a ticketed passenger. Whitmore's answer was that she was agitated and erratic, that his 27 years of flight experience had given him a faculty for reading passengers that went beyond what could be documented in a boarding pass check, and that his instinct, his professional, experienced, legally protected instinct as pilot in command, told him she represented a potential safety risk to the 200 other souls on the aircraft he was responsible for. The word agitated landed in the gate area and did something interesting, which was that it caused approximately 30 people to look at Naomi with the particular evaluative attention of people who have been told to see one thing and are instead seeing another. And what they saw was a woman standing still, completely unusually still, with her hands open at her sides, her boarding pass displayed on her phone, her weight evenly distributed, her face composed but entirely, almost unnervingly calm, and the dissonance between the word and the reality was both immediate and audible in the form of a collective exhale and a murmur that moved through the queue like a small wave. Diane Folsom was standing 4 places back in the business class queue. A woman in her mid-60s with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried bearing of someone who has spent decades in rooms where what she said carried legal weight, and who had therefore developed a precise and economic relationship with language that meant she spoke rarely but precisely. She had been watching the confrontation since Whitmore's hand came down on the scanner, and she had spent the intervening minutes making the same evaluative calculations that jurors make, and juries, and appeals courts, and she had reached a conclusion. She said clearly, and without raising her voice, that she had been standing at this gate for 22 minutes, and that the woman in the navy pantsuit had not moved, had not raised her voice, had not made any gesture that a reasonable person would describe as agitated, and that she was happy to state that observation to any official who needed to hear it. Whitmore turned toward Diane with the expression of a man who has encountered an unexpected obstacle and is deciding whether to go around it or through it. And he told her that airline safety procedures were not a matter for passenger commentary, and that she should direct her attention to her own boarding process. Diane looked at him for a long moment with the particular patience of someone who has heard a great many people say things they believed were final and has watched them discover that they were not. And she said nothing more, But she took out her phone with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who is performing an action they intend to complete, and she pointed it at the gate podium, and she began to record. Priya was on the radio now, her voice so unsteady that the transmission was barely coherent, the words coming in fragments that the dispatcher on the other end was asking her to repeat, and the sound of her struggling was audible to everyone nearby. And it was somehow the most painful sound in the gate area, more painful than Whitmore's contempt, more painful than the murmuring crowd, because it was the sound of a person being used against herself, being made into an instrument of something she knew was wrong, and not having the institutional support to refuse. Naomi watched Priya. She heard every fragment of the broken transmission. She watched the young woman's hand shake around the radio. And she filed all of it, the terror, the compliance, the impossible position, the absence of anyone above Priya in the chain who was present to tell her she had other options with the careful, sorrowful precision of someone who is not simply witnessing a crisis, but understanding with growing clarity the depth of the infrastructure that produced it. And then Whitmore leaned in. He moved closer, close enough that only Naomi and Priya could hear him, close enough that the directional microphone on James Okafor's camera, positioned 20 feet away with a clear line of sight, caught the audio in a register that would later be enhanced in post-production and would be heard in perfect clarity by 7 million people. And he said the thing that removed any remaining possibility of interpretation. The thing that was not protocol or safety or fraud prevention, but simply the thing itself unmediated the exact shape of what had been living inside this institution for as long as anyone on this flight had been alive. Naomi did not flinch. She held his gaze. She let the words land, and in the space where a lesser person might have felt destroyed, she felt something clarify the way a diagnosis clarifies, the way a map clarifies, the way a problem that has finally been named is already in the naming beginning to become something that can be solved. The two airport police officers arrived at 7:21 a.m. responding to the radio call with the professional wariness of people who have been dispatched to gate disruptions before, and know that such calls exist on a spectrum ranging from drunk passenger to something that is going to be in the news, and whose initial read of the situation, a well-dressed black woman standing calmly at a gate podium, a captain with his arms folded, a gate agent who looked as though she might need medical attention, did not immediately tell them which end of the spectrum this was. Officer Dana Reyes and Officer Paul Ostrowski positioned themselves with the practiced neutrality of people trained to enter a situation without immediately taking a side, and Paul asked in the standard tone of someone opening a negotiation whose resolution they have not yet determined what the trouble was. Whitmore performed for them. It was, Naomi had to acknowledge, a genuinely skilled performance, the kind that comes from decades of inhabiting authority and understanding intuitively what authority looks like to those beneath it and how to deploy the appearance of authority to do the work of substance in situations where substance has run out. He gave them his name, his title, his years of service, and then he delivered the characterization of Naomi in the coded language of airline safety concern. Erratic, possibly impaired trust. My instincts. 200 souls. I cannot risk it with the measured gravity of a man who is not attacking a person but reluctantly protecting an aircraft. Which is a very different thing and sounds very different and lands very differently on the ears of two police officers trying to determine whether they are looking at a bigot or a conscientious professional. Dana turned to Naomi with the professional courtesy of someone attempting neutrality while a strong institutional current is pushing them in a particular direction, and asked for her identification. Naomi gave her everything: driver's license, boarding pass, the credit card used to purchase the ticket, all three items presenting the same name in the same spelling with the same photograph. She stated each item as she presented it clearly and without emotional inflection, because she had learned a long time ago that in situations like this, one clarity is the only protection that cannot be taken away. Dana took the ID and the phone to the podium to run the name. Paul remained near Whitmore, and the three of them, The captain, the officer, and Naomi waited in a silence that had the quality of held breath. Dana came back. The ID was valid. No warrants of any kind. The ticket was confirmed and fully paid. Everything was clean. Paul turned back to Whitmore and asked genuinely and not unkindly what the specific safety threat was, because what he was looking at did not match the description he had been given. And this was the moment when Whitmore, having been given one last opportunity to stop to recalibrate, to find some version of a reasonable exit from the position he had constructed for himself, instead chose to dig further in, because men like Whitmore Naomi had observed over the years often have a tremendous capacity for escalation and a very limited one for retreat, and the presence of an audience and the accumulated weight of his own certainty made retreat feel not like wisdom, but like surrender. He said his gut. He said 27 years. He said the word narcotics with the casual precision of someone deploying a grenade and stepping back because narcotics in the mouth of an airline captain is a specific and legally protected concern that police officers are trained to take seriously, and it reframed everything. It reframed Naomi's stillness as the stillness of impairment rather than composure. It reframed her precise speech as calculated concealment rather than intelligence. It reframed the entire confrontation as something other than what it was. It was, Naomi thought, almost admirable in its cynicism. The standoff settled into its final shape. Dana and Paul could not arrest Naomi because she had committed no act that constituted an offense under any law they were empowered to enforce. But they could not compel Whitmore to board her because the pilot in command of an aircraft has a legally protected authority over who boards that aircraft, an authority that exists for legitimate safety reasons, and that Whitmore was now using as a shield behind which none of his actual reasons were visible. The plane was grounded. Not by weather, not by mechanical failure, not by anything that could be addressed through the normal channels of airline operations, but by one man's refusal expressed in the language of institutional authority to allow a black woman to sit in the seat she had purchased. Naomi surveyed the situation with the comprehensive, unrushed attention she had been bringing to everything since 7:02 a.m. The police who were uncomfortable and increasingly skeptical. The co-pilot who was standing against the wall with the posture of a man who has used up his courage and is not sure what comes next. The gate agent who was still trembling. The watching crowd whose phones had been raised for 11 minutes. And the captain who was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has won every fight he has ever entered and has not yet understood that this one is different. She reached for her phone. She did not look at Whitmore when she did it. She simply dialed from memory a number she had entered into her contacts 48 hours ago because she was the kind of person who prepared for the contingencies she hoped would never arrive. Whitmore said something about lawyers. Naomi waited for the call to connect. Arthur Webb picked up on the second ring, which told Naomi that his phone was in his hand, which told her that someone had already flagged to him that something unusual was happening at Gate K7, which was useful information about the internal communication chain, and she noted it even as she began to speak. She gave him everything in the order he would need it. Her name, the gate number, the flight number, the captain's name, spelled out letter by letter, because precision in this moment was not pedantry but documentation. The nature of the situation stated in plain declarative sentences without interpretive language. She had been denied boarding by the pilot in command who had stated she was a safety risk and used security to attempt her removal, and who had denied her boarding on the basis of criteria that had nothing to do with safety. She told him she needed him at Gate K7 in 3 minutes with the head of airport security and a replacement captain, and that the 3 minutes was not a suggestion. She hung up. The gate was completely silent in the manner of a room in which everyone is pretending very hard to be doing something other than listening and failing, because what they had just witnessed was too specific and too strange to be processed as background noise. Whitmore's face went through a sequence of expressions in the seconds after the call ended. Contempt first, then a slight narrowing as the name Arthur Webb arrived in some internal registry and rang against something. Then a flicker of recalibration, and then a return to contempt, because contempt was where Derek Whitmore lived, and it took more than a phone call to evict him from his residence. Priya had stopped shaking. She was doing something on her computer, her hands moving with a new and different quality of urgency. Not the urgency of managing a crisis, but the urgency of someone who is looking for something specific and is afraid of what they might find. And when she found it, Naomi could see the change in Priya's body from 6 feet away, the way the breath left her in a single quiet, involuntary rush. Priya had found the company-wide email that had gone out 4 days ago at 2:16 p.m. on a Friday under the subject line Valor Airways Leadership Update, a new chapter. The email had been sent to all 14,000 Valor employees, including every gate agent at every hub in the network, and it contained 3 paragraphs about strategic direction and 1 paragraph about the new CEO. And beneath that paragraph, a professionally shot photograph of a woman in a navy suit with her hair pulled back and a thin gold watch on her left wrist, and beneath the photograph, in the clean sans serif font of Valor's internal communications template, the words, Naomi Reeves, Chief Executive Officer. Priya looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked at the woman standing 3 feet in front of her. Then she looked at Captain Whitmore, who was still performing confidence with the diminishing conviction of someone whose audience has started to look past him at the screen behind his head. She turned the monitor toward him. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Naomi had heard all morning. What left Derek Whitmore's face in the moment he saw the photograph was not merely confidence. It was the entire architecture of the certainty he had spent 27 years constructing, the certainty that he was the permanent, immovable center of every room he entered, that the institutional gravity of his position would always in the end pull everything toward him, and that the woman in the navy suit was exactly what she appeared to be, which was nobody who could touch him. The monitor said otherwise. Naomi looked at her watch. Not to check the time she knew the time, but to mark it, to let the gesture be visible, to say without words that the 3 minutes she had named on the phone were already passing, and that the interval between now and their end was the only interval that remained in Derek Whitmore's career as the man who controlled this gate. She said 1 sentence about the 3 minutes and the ticking. The sound of running in an airport concourse is almost always bad news. It means a missed connection, or a medical emergency, or the particular institutional panic that occurs when someone in a position of responsibility becomes aware all at once of the full scope of what has gone wrong on their watch. And the sound of Arthur Webb running toward Gate K7 was all of these things, and also something more specific, which was the sound of a 22-year company career flashing before its owner's eyes in the approximately 90 seconds it took him to cover the distance from the operations corridor to the gate. He arrived with 2 junior executives behind him, all 3 of them slightly out of breath and wearing the expression of people who have been briefed in transit and are still integrating the briefing, and he skidded to a halt in front of the gate podium and looked at Naomi with the particular kind of recognition that arrives not as certainty, but as dawning horror, the horror of a man who is looking at the consequences of a decision that was made long before he arrived, and that he now has to be the face of. Arthur Webb was 57 years old, heavy-set in the way of a man who had once been athletic and had traded athleticism for tenure, and his face in this moment was doing something complicated, cycling through apology and disbelief and corporate damage control calculation, and something that might, underneath all of that, have been genuine shame. Because Arthur was not a bad man, he was a man who had made the particular kind of accommodation that institutions reward and conscience costs, which is the accommodation of looking away from things you cannot afford to name. And now the thing he had looked away from for years was standing in front of him in a navy pantsuit with her arms crossed and 3 minutes on the clock. He said something about unacceptability, about not representing who they were. The words came out unevenly, not because he didn't mean them, but because the distance between what he meant and what he had allowed was suddenly physically present in the room with him. Naomi gave him no time to find his footing in the abstract. She named what had happened in the specific, concrete operational language that made it undeniable the delay already accumulating, the fuel burn cost, the compensation liability for 200 passengers on an international route, the reputational exposure that was currently being filmed by at least 5 phones at Gate K7, and then she asked him the question she needed him to answer. On the record, was this who Valor Airways was? Arthur turned to look at Whitmore, and the look between them was not the look of two people seeing each other for the first time, but the look of two people seeing each other. Perhaps, honestly, for the first time, the look of a 22-year company man who had filed away a great many concerns about a great many behaviors and marked them manageable, looking at the cost of all those years of management. Whitmore tried once more. His voice had lost its authority entirely, and was now just the noise of a man reaching for something that had already left his hands, and he said he didn't know which was perhaps the most honest thing he had said at Gate K7 that morning. Naomi looked at him when he said it. She let the words finish. Then she said the thing that had been true since 5:03 a.m. on a Friday 4 days ago, when the board had countersigned her contract and she had walked out of Robert Ashby's conference room into the elevator and thought, now the work begins. She said that was the entire point. And then she turned to Arthur Webb, and the work began. Arthur Webb's formal suspension of Captain Derek Whitmore was delivered in the particular register of a man who has done difficult things before and knows that the only way to do them well is to do them clearly, without performance and without cruelty, because performance makes it theatrical and cruelty makes it personal. And neither of those is what this moment required. What this moment required was precision, and Arthur, whatever his failures of the past 22 years, had precision. He said Gregory Whitmore. He used the first name which Whitmore had perhaps not heard, used in a professional context in years, and which had the effect of removing the captain that served as both title and armor. You are suspended. Effective immediately pending review for gross misconduct, passenger endangerment, and conduct unbecoming of a Valor Airways flight crew member. Your credentials and cockpit access will be deactivated before this flight departs. You are directed to surrender your company ID to the security personnel who will accompany you from this terminal. The passengers who had been watching received this in silence, the particular silence of people who have been hoping for something and are now watching it happen and are not quite ready to believe it is real. Whitmore's response moved through stages, as these things do when a man who has inhabited authority for a very long time is confronted with its removal. First, the union invoked with the reflexive certainty of someone who has seen the union function as a wall against consequence and expects the wall to appear now. Then, unlawful termination cited with the specificity of someone who has rehearsed it in some interior theater of self-protection. Then, entrapment deployed with the rising urgency of someone who is reaching for frameworks. Any frameworks that might recast what is happening as something being done to him rather than something resulting from what he did. And then, finally, a turn to Salinas, a direct, almost desperate appeal to the co-pilot to confirm, to corroborate, to stand alongside him, the way Salinas had stood alongside him for 2 years, quietly, and without objection on every flight where Whitmore had been exactly who he was today. Salinas looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. He looked at Whitmore with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been given permission to set it down. He said nothing. He simply stood where he was, and his silence was the most complete answer available. Naomi had already turned away from Whitmore before Salinas's silence was finished. Not with drama, not with the performance of dismissal, but with the particular economy of someone for whom the matter is settled, and the next matter requires attention. She addressed First Officer Ray Salinas directly. and she asked him 3 questions in a tone that was neither warm nor cold, but simply interested, the genuine interest of someone who is trying to understand what is in front of her. How long had he been a first officer? 7 years, he said. Was he rated to command the 777? Yes, he had his captain's certification, had held it for 3 years. Why hadn't he been promoted to captain despite the certification? Salinas answered the 3rd question with the careful, measured honesty of a man who has had to find language for something painful, and what he said was the seniority progression above him had been frozen for years, occupied by a cohort of senior captains who were never going to retire and never going to be moved, and that every conversation he had attempted about promotion had been redirected toward patience and tenure and the idea that his time would come, which is what institutions say when they want to preserve the current arrangement while maintaining the fiction that the arrangement is temporary. Naomi looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Captain Salinas." Just those 2 words with a slight pause between them that gave the title room to be real. The gate area received the field promotion, the way live audiences receive something they were hoping for but did not quite dare to expect a beat of total silence. And then one person began to clap and then another, and within 4 seconds the applause was rolling through the business class queue and the economy line and reaching the back of the boarding area. And it was not the polite applause of people going through a social motion, but the genuine, slightly astonished applause of people who have just watched something that seemed impossible become ordinary, which is what justice looks like when it actually happens. Not dramatic, not ordained, just real. Ray Salinas stood very still in the middle of the applause, and he looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at Naomi. And then he looked once at Whitmore, not with triumph, not with vindication, but with the simple and quiet expression of a man who has been afraid of something for a long time and has just discovered that it is over. And then he straightened his jacket, asked Arthur Webb about the reserve. Co-pilot confirmed the answer and turned toward the jet bridge with the specific, unhesitating stride of a man who has somewhere to be. The applause faded, and the gate area rearranged itself into the ordinary business of an international departure. Passengers gathering bags, preparing to cue the older male agent emerging from the back office with the particular expression of a man who has been hiding in a storm cellar and is now attempting to present himself as having been nearby all along. And in the space of this rearrangement, Naomi walked to the gate podium and stood across from Priya Anand, who was still at her station with the mascara dried into pale tracks on her cheeks, and her hands very still on the keyboard, in the manner of someone who is trying not to draw attention to the fact that they are shaking. Naomi did not offer comfort first, because comfort in this situation would be a gift given before it had been earned, and Priya had not yet had to sit with what she had done and understand it fully, and without that understanding, comfort would just be an erasure, a way of making the moment smaller than it was, so that both of them could move through it. Faster and smaller was not what either of them needed. She said, in the same clear factual tone she had used at the scanner 40 minutes earlier, "You had choices during this confrontation that you did not take." She named them not as accusations, but as a list the way you name items in an audit report without the emotional overlay that makes people defensive rather than thoughtful. She could have called her floor supervisor. The 3 unanswered messages on her screen were a failure above Priya's level, but the 4th message could have been a call, not a text, and calls are harder to ignore. She could have spoken directly to the police officers when they arrived and told them what she knew, which was that the boarding pass was valid, and she had confirmed it with the scanner, and the passenger had not raised her voice or moved from her position in the boarding line. She could have, at any point, simply told the truth about what she had actually witnessed, which was a calm passenger and an aggressive captain, and let that truth go onto the record and deal with the consequences. None of those things would have required heroism. All of them would have required the specific practical courage of a person who is willing to do their actual job, even when the person above them in the hierarchy is pressuring them to do something else. And that kind of courage is not given or withheld by temperament. It is built by institutions either supported or undermined by the cultures those institutions create, and Valor's culture had been undermining it for a very long time. Priya asked in a voice that was very small if she was fired. Naomi said no. She said administrative leave pending a review, not of Priya's conduct in isolation, but of the entire gate agent support infrastructure at this hub, the staffing levels, the supervisor response protocols, the escalation procedures that were supposed to exist for exactly these situations and had apparently not functioned in any meaningful way this morning. She told Priya that Valor created too many bystanders, and that she needed to understand the architecture of that, how the institution built the conditions in which someone with Priya's obvious competence and obvious conscience ended up frozen at a gate podium doing something she knew was wrong, and what it would take to change those conditions so that the next Priya would have somewhere to stand. Before she turned toward the jet bridge, Naomi took her phone from her jacket pocket and photographed the screen on Priya's workstation, the 3 unanswered supervisor backup requests time-stamped, sitting in the message queue like a record of an absence, and she put her phone away without comment. Priya watched her do this, and she understood that the photograph was not a threat, but a promise that the failure it documented would not be forgotten, that it would become part of the accounting, that the person above her who had not responded at 5:31 or 5:52 or 6:15 would at some point have to account for that silence, and that the accounting would be real, rather than the kind of performative institutional review that produces a memo no one reads and a procedure no one follows. Priya was not absolved. She was not condemned. She was given something harder than either of those. She was given the responsibility of understanding what had happened and building something from it, and the weight of that was visible in her face as Naomi walked away, along with something else, something quieter and less certain that might, given time and the right conditions, become the first foundation of a different kind of courage. Naomi turned to face the passengers of Flight 208, the business class queue, the economy line that stretched back toward the main concourse, the families reorganizing themselves around their luggage, the road warriors who had been watching the entire confrontation with the focused attention of people who had seen a great many things in airports and recognized this as something different, and she introduced herself. Not as the CEO of Valor Airways, though she was that, and not with the language of corporate address, the kind of language that creates professional distance between the speaker and the audience, but simply as the person responsible for what they had just witnessed, and the person responsible for making sure they arrived in London. She said her name. She said she was sorry for the delay they had experienced, not in the abstract way of institutional apology, but in the specific human way of someone acknowledging that their time had been taken without their consent, and that this was a real cost, and she did not take it lightly. She told them the flight would depart in 10 minutes. Then she stepped to Priya's station where the older male agent had quietly materialized at the scanner, and she held out her phone with the boarding pass displayed, and the scanner beeped green and the display read, Reeves, Naomi Seat, 14C, Business Valor, 208LGW, and she walked to the jet bridge. Behind her, someone began to clap, just one person at first, and then it grew, and she did not turn around because the applause was not something that required acknowledgement. It was simply something that people do when they have witnessed something being made right after being made wrong, and she let it be what it was. Inside the jet bridge, out of sight of the gate, she stopped. She put one hand flat against the curved wall of the bridge, and she stood there for 10 seconds, maybe 15, with her eyes closed and the ambient noise of the terminal humming around her. The PA announcements, the distant clatter of luggage, the particular recycled air smell of an international departures corridor at 7:30 in the morning, and she let the weight of the last 40 minutes settle into her body, the way weight does after a long effort, felt it in her shoulders and her jaw and the exact center of her chest. She thought about her mother. Not the watch, not the advice, not any specific memory, just the presence of her, the particular quality of her mother's attention, On the days when Naomi had come home from somewhere, having been made to feel small, and her mother had looked at her and said, "You are not small, and the people who needed you to be have told you something important about themselves, not about you." She thought 68 hours as CEO of Valor Airways, and she had already met the problem. She had already seen its face. She had its name. She straightened. She picked up her carry-on. She walked down the jet bridge and onto the aircraft and the flight attendant at the door. Gloria, a woman who had clearly been briefed on the situation by someone monitoring the gate feed, looked at Naomi with an expression that was partly terror and partly something that was not quite hope but was in the same neighborhood, and Naomi read her name tag and said, "Gloria, just run the flight the way you normally would. I want to see the real thing." The cabin of a 777 in the moments before departure has a quality of held anticipation that is almost architectural. All that suspended purpose. All those people arranged in rows with their particular forms of readiness. The overhead bins closed, the seat belts clicked, the electronic devices theoretically stowed, and Naomi settled into 14C and opened her laptop and felt the aircraft begin to move beneath her with the particular deep vibration that she had always found unexpectedly calming. She had noted the flight attendants at the door, Gloria and a younger one named Ben, who had the wide-eyed attentiveness of someone who understood that today was not a normal day, and was determined to respond to that understanding by being extremely good at his job. And she had noted the passengers around her who were doing the thing that people do when they have just witnessed something extraordinary, which is to arrange their faces into the expression of people who are not talking about it while clearly thinking about nothing else. She wrote, "Cabin crew Gloria professional composure under significant stress. Ben good instincts, visible effort. Service quality, pending observation." Then she closed the laptop and looked out the window. The PA chimed. The voice that came through was not Derek Whitmore's, not the practiced boom of a man performing authority for an audience, but something quieter and steadier, with a slight roughness of genuine feeling underneath the professionalism. The voice of a man who is doing something he has wanted to do for a very long time and is aware of it, and is not quite managing to conceal the awareness entirely which made it. Naomi thought perhaps the most authentic captain's announcement she had heard on any flight she had ever taken. Captain Ray Salinas said, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to begin by thanking you for your patience with a departure that has been anything but ordinary." He acknowledged the delay without deflection and without the euphemistic corporate language that turns "we made a mistake" into "we experienced an operational adjustment." He gave the flight time 7 hours and 42 minutes to Gatwick favorable tailwinds. Smooth ride forecast over the Atlantic, and he asked them with a slight formality that did not quite conceal something warmer beneath it to sit back and let his crew take care of them. That was all. Simple, professional, human, and entirely genuine. Naomi looked out the window as the aircraft turned away from gate K7 and began its path toward the runway, and through the glass she could see in the distance the lights of a Valor Airways ground vehicle moving away from the terminal along a service road. Not toward the aircraft, but away toward the employee parking area on the far side of the facility. And she understood that the vehicle was carrying Derek Whitmore out of the terminal that had been his domain for 11 years. And she did not feel triumph at the sight of it, because triumph was not the appropriate response to the removal of a cancer. And she was too aware of the cost of what the cancer had done to Priya, to Gloria, to Camille, who had resigned 8 months ago, rather than stay in a place where her complaint would be filed and buried to every passenger who had been made to feel wrong for occupying a seat they had paid for, to feel anything as simple as triumph. She made a note, in-flight service observation beginning 7:44 a.m. Then she made another note on a separate page in handwriting, slightly less neat than her operational notes, Salinas. Good man. Good captain. Should have been flying this seat 3 years ago. She put the notebook away and watched Chicago fall beneath the clouds. The grid of streets, the silver thread of the river, the pale blue of the lake spreading out to the east, and she thought, 68 hours as CEO, and already the first thing she had done was the most important thing, because the first thing is always the thing that tells the institution who you are, and she needed this institution to know with complete and irreversible clarity who she was. The aircraft climbed into the clear morning sky and turned east toward the ocean. Naomi was somewhere over Indiana with her laptop open and 3 separate audit documents running simultaneously on split screen when she became aware that someone was standing in the aisle beside her seat, and she looked up to find James Okafor, the man from 3 places back in the economy queue, the one with the camera bag and the directional microphone and the unhurried attention of a professional witness standing there with the particular self-possessed courtesy of someone who is accustomed to approaching strangers in contexts where the approach requires careful management. He introduced himself quietly using his full name and his professional title, documentary filmmaker based in London, traveling to the BFY Festival with a short film about institutional accountability, which had won a jury prize at a festival in Amsterdam the previous spring, and he said that he had footage from the incident at Gate K7 that he wanted her to see before he made any decisions about it. He was not going to post it without her permission. He was not pitching a story. He was not, he said, approaching her in his capacity as a filmmaker, but in his capacity as a person who had witnessed something and who believed that the people at the center of such things should have the opportunity to see themselves from the outside. Naomi set down her laptop and asked him to show her. He opened his camera, a professional-grade compact with a small screen on the swivel back, and played her 90 seconds of footage that had been edited from multiple sources: his own camera, 2 passengers' phones from different angles, and the directional audio that had been running throughout. She watched herself. She saw herself from the outside for the first time, and the experience was both stranger and more clarifying than she had expected stranger, because it is always strange to see yourself as others see you, to find that the interior experience of a moment and its exterior appearance are not quite the same thing, and more clarifying because what the footage showed was not what she had felt inside the confrontation, but what any person watching it would see, which was a woman standing completely still, hands open at her sides, speaking in a level voice, while a uniformed captain loomed over her and used words that the directional microphone had captured with complete and unambiguous clarity. She heard the words he had whispered. She heard them in the clean, preserved audio of a professional recording, and they were exactly what she had heard at the gate, but hearing them in playback, hearing them as a document, as a record, as something that now existed outside the moment and could not be taken back, had a different quality to it, a weightier and more permanent quality, the quality of evidence rather than experience. She looked at the footage for another moment after it ended. Then she looked at James Okafor. She told him she would call her communications director from Gatwick and would be in contact with him before he disembarked. She asked for his card. He gave it to her, a simple white card, his name and a website address, and he thanked her for her time and returned to his seat in the economy cabin with the same unhurried, self-possessed composure with which he had arrived. Naomi sat for a while without opening her laptop. She sat with the experience of having seen herself standing still while someone tried to make her small, and found that the stillness had been real, not performance, not strategy, just the accumulated result of 44 years of being exactly who she was, in exactly the kind of room that wanted her to be someone else. And she found that she was unexpectedly grateful for the footage, not because it would be useful, though it would be extremely useful, but because it showed her something she had not been able to see from the inside, that the stillness had looked like strength. And strength was not the same thing as anger, and anger was not what this moment required of her. What this moment required was architecture, and she was already building it. She was already. The cabin had been dark for 2 hours by the time the coast of Newfoundland passed below them, invisible beneath a layer of cloud that the aircraft's wing lights touched only in the nearest edge. And most of the 200 passengers of Flight 208 were asleep in the particular horizontal and semi-horizontal configurations that business and economy class respectively allowed, and the overhead reading lights were mostly off, and the aircraft moved through the dark above the North Atlantic with the unhurried, indifferent momentum of a thing performing its function, regardless of what was happening inside it. Naomi was awake. She was not anxious. Anxiety was not her relationship with sleeplessness, had not been since her early 30s, when she had learned to distinguish between the sleeplessness that comes from fear and the sleeplessness that comes from thinking. And this was the latter, the kind that has a quality almost of urgency to it, the insistence of a problem that does not want to wait until morning to be addressed. She thought about the board presentation, the 112 slides, the charts and metrics, and the language of operational underperformance. And she thought about how completely that presentation had missed the thing she had found at Gate K7 this morning, and she thought about how it could have missed it, what the mechanism was by which an entire executive team could build a comprehensive diagnosis of a company's problems and leave out the thing that was actually the problem. The answer, she thought, was not dishonesty, but a particular kind of trained blindness. The blindness that institutions develop when the cost of seeing a thing clearly is higher than the cost of seeing it approximately, and when the people responsible for seeing it clearly are the same people who benefit from the approximate vision. She thought about the passengers who had come before her, not just on this flight, not just at Gate K7, but on all the flights across all the years, on all the routes where Derek Whitmore, or someone like Derek Whitmore, had stood at the gate and made a decision about who belonged in the seat they had paid for. And she thought about those passengers not as data points in a complaint report, but as specific people with specific reasons for being on specific flights, people who had places to be and things to do and lives that were organized around the assumption that a valid ticket was a promise the airline would keep. She thought about the ones who had not been her, who had not had the particular phone call to make at 7:21 a.m., the ones who had been turned away and moved to the back and questioned and challenged and made to feel like the problem, and who had no recourse except to file a complaint that would be read by Phil Greer and marked no action required, and filed in a system that no one above Greer's level would ever look at, until the morning a new CEO sat down at a desk and asked for the last 3 years of complaint data and began to read. She thought about her mother, who had taken a different airline because Valor had a reputation, and she thought about what that meant. That the reputation had reached her. Mother had reached the specific community of working women who pass information about how to navigate institutions that were not built for them, had reached her mother's church and her mother's neighborhood, and the quiet, informal network by which black women in America have always shared the knowledge of which doors are actually open and which ones just look open. And she thought about what it would mean to change that, not just in press releases and DEI initiatives and the language of the annual report, but in the actual physical lived experience of a woman buying a ticket and presenting herself at a gate and being treated as a customer rather than a problem. She opened her notebook and began to write, and the writing had a different quality to it than the operational notes she had been making since 6:45 a.m. It had the quality of a letter rather than a report, a letter to someone who was not yet present but was always in some sense who she was working for. Gloria Mensah had been working for Valor Airways for 19 years, which was long enough to remember when the culture had been different. Not perfect. Not without its structural blind spots and institutional failures, but different, more attended to in some way, more aware of itself and what it owed the people inside it, and long enough to have watched year by year and increment by increment the way that culture had changed as certain people rose and certain values were quietly de-emphasized and certain complaints were quietly not followed up on and certain careers were quietly ended, and to have developed as a result of all this, watching the particular combination of clarity and helplessness that comes from understanding a problem completely and having no power to address it. She approached Naomi's seat at 37,000 feet with a small bottle of sparkling water held in front of her, like an offering, or perhaps like a reason, something to justify the approach, something to hold, if the approach turned out to be a mistake. She said she was sorry for the interruption. Then she said on behalf of the entire crew, "Thank you." Naomi set down her pen and looked at her, and Gloria saw in that look the quality of attention that she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it. For 19 years, genuine, unhurried, interested attention. The attention of someone who will hear what you say and remember it and do something about it, which is different from the attention of someone who will hear it and feel sympathetic about it, which is different again from the attention of someone who will hear it and redirect it immediately into a process that will produce no outcome. Gloria sat down in the empty seat across the aisle, and she talked. She talked about Captain Derek Whitmore and the 11 years he had operated out of Valor's Chicago hub, and about the name the crew had for him, the Wall, which he had heard and had taken in his particular way as a compliment because he understood it as a reference to his authority and did not understand or did not choose to understand the other dimension of the name, which was that walls are what stop things from getting through, and what was not getting through on Derek Whitmore's flights was the well-being of anyone he had decided did not belong. She talked about the 4 formal complaints filed against him in 7 years. She knew the number because she had checked the file herself twice through channels she was not supposed to have access to, but which a 19-year veteran of a company learns to navigate, and about the man who had received those complaints, a regional VP named Phil Greer, who had been Whitmore's poker partner and hunting companion, and had apparently operated on the professional principle that institutional authority exists partly to protect the people you like from the consequences of the things they do. She talked about Camille Osei, one of the best flight attendants she had ever worked with. Camille, who had filed against Whitmore 18 months ago after an incident on a Miami-Chicago overnight that Gloria had witnessed from 2 rows away, and that had been, in her professional opinion, among the worst things she had seen in 2 decades of commercial aviation, and about how Camille had been reassigned to cargo routes within 5 weeks of filing and had lasted 3 months on cargo before resigning, and had sent Gloria a single text message on her last day that said, "I can't stay where staying means accepting that this is what I'm worth." She talked about the 2 other flight attendants who had filed, whose names she gave to Naomi without hesitation because she had been waiting to give them to someone who could use them. She talked about the time she herself had filed 2 years ago after a passenger incident that Whitmore had handled in a way that she considered a direct safety risk, and about reading the resolution 3 days later reviewed no action required. She said, "I've told new people over the years that eventually it catches up with men like him, that the institution protects itself, that accountability comes, and I stopped believing that. I think sometime around the 4th or 5th time I watched it not come." And then tonight she paused and looked at Naomi directly. Tonight it came. Naomi asked one question quietly, "Who has Camille's contact information?" Gloria looked at her for a moment. Then she said she had memorized the number the day Camille left because she had known even then that someday it might matter that someone had it. Naomi wrote the number down in her notebook. Then she wrote 2 other names, which were the 2 flight attendants Gloria had named, and a 3rd name, which was Phil Greer, and she drew a line connecting all 3 names to a single word that she underlined twice: accountability. She thanked Gloria not effusively, not in the manner of someone performing gratitude, but quietly and directly, the way you thank someone for something that cost them something to give, which was the appropriate acknowledgement for what Gloria had just done, which was to trust that this time would be different, after a long time of things not being different, which is one of the most specific and difficult kinds of courage available. Gloria went back to work. Naomi picked up her pen. In the last 2 hours before Gatwick, while most of the cabin slept and the aircraft made its way over Ireland and turned south toward England, Naomi wrote with the focused, almost physical urgency of someone building something against a deadline, filling pages of her audit notebook with the careful architecture of what she was already thinking of as the accountability review. It was not a disciplinary document, though it would produce disciplinary outcomes. It was not a PR strategy, though it would inevitably have PR dimensions. It was in its essential nature an act of cartography. She was mapping the territory of a culture, tracing the lines of protection and silence that had allowed a man like Derek Whitmore to operate in plain sight for 11 years, identifying the specific nodes where the information about his conduct had arrived and been absorbed and redirected away from consequence. The map had a clear geography. Whitmore at the center, surrounded by a web of institutional accommodations, Phil Greer and his buried complaint resolutions, the union that had used its organizational weight to make accountability expensive rather than inevitable. The managers above Greer who had never asked why the complaint-to-resolution ratio for senior crew looked the way it did. The HR protocols that treated single incidents in isolation rather than as part of a pattern that was visible when you put them together and invisible when you kept them apart. She wrote names. She wrote dates. She drew lines. On a separate page, she made a list of the people who had been directly harmed by this Webb Camille and the 2 other flight attendants with their contact information and the dates of their complaints and reassignments. She wrote Priya's name with a note about the 3 unanswered supervisor messages and the chronic understaffing at K7 that had put her in an impossible position, and a separate note about the floor supervisor who had not responded and what accountability for that non-response should look like. On a 3rd page, she wrote 2 words and underlined them: Captain Salinas. Beneath them, a single sentence about the seniority structure that had kept a certified, qualified, clearly capable officer in a co-pilot seat for 3 years past the point where he should have been commanding his own aircraft, and a note about what retroactive adjustment to his pay and seniority record would be appropriate, and how quickly it could be processed. She sat back and looked at what she had written. 4 pages of notebook paper dense with names and dates and structural observations and action items, the skeleton of a reform that would take months to complete and would touch every level of Valor's operations. And she felt not the satisfaction of completion, but the specific, energizing feeling of a beginning, which she had always found more motivating than endings because endings close things and beginnings open them. The aircraft began its descent over the English countryside, and the dawn came through the windows amber first, then gold spreading across the low green fields below in the particular quality of English morning light that she had always found unexpectedly beautiful. A softness in the air that the American Midwest, for all its spaces, had never quite replicated. And she closed her notebook and put away her laptop and looked out the window and let it be beautiful for a moment without immediately converting it into a note. She thought her mother used to say that beauty is not a luxury. It's a reminder that the world is larger than whatever problem you're standing inside, and that the problem is worth solving because the world that surrounds it is worth living in. The fields below her were very green. The light on them was very gold. She let herself have 30 seconds of it, which was about what the approach would allow before the wheels touched down, and the next thing began. The touchdown at Gatwick was smooth and unhurried, the kind of landing that communicates quiet competence rather than effort. And when Captain Ray Salinas came on the PA for the last time, the warmth in his voice had settled into something more natural than it had been at departure. The nervousness burned away by 7 hours and 42 minutes of doing the thing he had been trained for and had not until today been permitted to do. And what remained was the voice of someone who has found the register of their own authority and recognized it as their own. He thanked the passengers for their patience on an unusual day. He said it had been a privilege to fly them. When he said your entire crew, Naomi heard Gloria's name in the phrase, and Camille's and the 2 women whose names she had written in her notebook and all the others whose names she did not yet have, but would. And she thought, this is what it sounds like when an institution begins to tell the truth about itself. She was the last passenger to deplane waiting, with the particular patience of someone who has things to do, and understands that some things take the time they take, and when the cabin had emptied, she walked forward to the cockpit door and found Salinas finishing his shutdown procedures, the careful, methodical completion of systems that had carried 200 people across an ocean and were now being returned to their resting state. She told him the field promotion was permanent. She told him the paperwork would be waiting in Chicago, and the salary adjustment would be retroactive to tonight's departure, and she saw him receive this with the particular physical response of someone who has been told something they wanted very much and had stopped wanting openly because wanting it openly had stopped feeling safe, which is a kind of damage that institutions inflict on the people inside them without ever issuing an invoice for it. She said, "Just be the Captain Whitmore never was. That's all. Protect your passengers, all of them. Respect your crew." He said, "Yes, ma'am," and she could hear in the two words that he meant them not as compliance but as commitment, the specific register of someone who has understood that they have been given not just a promotion, but a responsibility that is larger than the title that carries it. She walked off the aircraft into the Gatwick jet bridge, and her phone, which had been in airplane mode for 7 hours and 42 minutes, came alive. It came alive the way a thing comes alive when it has been accumulating energy in a contained space, and it suddenly released a cascade of notifications that arrived in such rapid succession that for a moment the screen just showed a blur of icons and numbers. Messages from Arthur Webb, from Communications Director Layla Osei, from Robert Ashby's assistant, from 3 board members, from her paralegal contact in Chicago from a number she didn't recognize, that turned out when she looked at it to be a producer from a major news network. She stopped walking in the middle of the jet bridge. She scrolled until she found what she was looking for, which was a notification from a news aggregator with the headline "Preview" visible before she opened it. She read the preview. She took one long breath, the kind that goes all the way down. Then she called Layla. Layla Osei had been awake for 4 hours by the time Naomi's call connected, which was itself information. Layla was not a person who woke up early unless something required it, and the quality of her voice when she answered alert and slightly electric in the manner of someone who has been monitoring something for hours and is now reporting on its current state told Naomi that the something had been significant and ongoing. They were in a lounge at Gatwick. Naomi, having found a quiet corner of the Valor Business Lounge with a strong black coffee and a clear line of sight to the television screens on the wall, which were showing on 2 of 3 visible channels footage from Gate K7, and Layla was walking her through the landscape of the last 8 hours with the focused, structured efficiency of a communications professional in the middle of a real-time crisis. The footage had gone live at approximately 2:15 a.m. Chicago time, posted not by James Okafor, who had honored his commitment to wait, but by a passenger in the economy queue whose phone footage had been shot from a different angle and had captured slightly less audio but enough context to be immediately and unmistakably legible. Within an hour, James Okafor's higher-quality footage had been shared by a media organization he had a relationship with, and the directional audio had been confirmed and verified, and the 2 clips together had created a complete visual and auditory record of the incident that left no dimension of Whitmore's conduct open to interpretation. By 6 a.m. London time, the clip had been seen by 2.3 million people. By the time Naomi's plane landed, it was 4.7 million and still climbing. The narrative, Layla said, was currently running in 2 directions simultaneously. The first direction was airline denies boarding to black woman. The second direction, arriving approximately 3 hours behind the first, as the full context of the incident became understood by the people commenting on it, was woman denied boarding turns out to be the airline's own CEO. The second narrative was dramatically more viral than the first because the dramatic irony of it was the kind that human beings find almost impossible to resist sharing. Valor stock was down 11% in early trading. The board had already convened an emergency call. The union had issued a statement calling the termination unlawful. Naomi listened to all of this without interruption, with the same quality of complete attention she had brought to Gloria's account at 37,000 feet. And when Layla finished, she said, "Here is what we're going to do. No corporate statement. No, we are deeply concerned and take these matters seriously. No investigation language, no review language, no passive voice institutional non-acknowledgement of the thing that had happened on camera in front of 200 witnesses and their phones. A personal statement. Her name, her voice, her words. She dictated it to Layla while the coffee went cold beside her, looking at the television screens and watching her own face, composed, still standing in a boarding line with a valid ticket running on loop above the chyron that had by now been updated to include the detail that made people stop scrolling. The statement said this happened. It happened because of a culture that I was hired to change. I was on that flight to see my airline honestly, and the airline showed me itself honestly, and what I saw was a failure that went far beyond one captain and one gate and one morning. I fired the captain. I promoted the co-pilot who spent 7 years being more qualified than his title. The woman who deserves your anger is me, the CEO, the person responsible, and I am accepting that responsibility starting now. The old guard is done. The new Valor is boarding. We have a great deal of work to do, and we are starting today." Layla was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "I am actually crying right now. This is the boldest and most honest statement I have ever written for anyone. You understand that legal is going to request 47 revisions. Naomi said it goes out as written in 2 hours. Legal reviews it as a courtesy, not an editorial board." She hung up and called Arthur Webb. Arthur Webb answered on the first ring, which told Naomi that he had been waiting for this call with the particular anticipation of someone who needs to be given a direction, because standing still is becoming unbearable, and she gave him one immediately. She did not begin with reassurance or context, or the diplomatic preamble that managers use to soften the instructions that follow. She simply told him what she needed, and in what order, and at what speed. Whitmore's termination package being built around gross misconduct, passenger endangerment, and conduct violations, the video evidence rendering the case legally airtight. Arthur confirmed the union had filed a grievance unlawful termination entrapment, and Naomi told him to pull every documented complaint ever filed against Whitmore, every resolution signed off under his name in the complaint system, and to have the complete file on her desk before she landed back in Chicago. She named Phil Greer. Arthur went quiet when she said the name, a specific quality of quiet, the quiet of a man who has been anticipating a particular conversation for longer than he would like to acknowledge, and she let the quiet sit for 3 seconds before she continued. Because 3 seconds was enough time for Arthur to understand that the conversation they were having was the real one, not the one about operational procedures. She asked him directly whether he had known that Greer had been burying complaints filed against Whitmore, and Arthur answered her with the honesty of a man who has calculated that honesty at this moment is both the right thing and the only viable option available to him. He said he had known there was a protection pattern. He had raised it once 3 years ago with the regional VP above Greer, and he had been told to leave it alone. Naomi said that conversation 3 years ago is now part of the record. She said you have a choice between being part of the accountability structure or being part of what the accountability structure dismantles, and she was giving him this conversation as an opportunity to choose, and the choice needed to be made before she boarded her return flight to Chicago. Arthur said, "I choose the first one." His voice had a quality of relief in it, the specific relief of someone who has been holding a weight for a very long time and has just been offered a legitimate place to set it down. She told him about Camille Osei, the name that dates the specific chain of events from the complaint filing to the reassignment to the resignation, and she told him she wanted Camille found contacted by Arthur personally, and offered her position back with full back pay calculated from the day she resigned and an additional position on a crew welfare review committee that Naomi would establish upon her return to Chicago if Camille wanted it. She told him she needed the names and current contact information for the 2 other flight attendants who had filed against Whitmore and been subject to retaliatory reassignment. She needed those on her desk alongside the Whitmore complaint file. She told him about Priya's 3 unanswered supervisor messages and the name of the floor supervisor who had not responded, and she told him that the Gate K7 staffing failure was not Priya's problem to own. It was a structural failure that began above Priya's level, and she wanted a full accounting of the staffing protocols for international departure gates at the Chicago hub with the specific identification of where the protocol had broken down on this particular morning. And then she told him about Captain Ray Salinas, and she did not frame it as an instruction but as a correction to a wrong that had been quietly sustained for 3 years by a seniority structure that Valor had allowed to calcify in service of the comfort of senior crew rather than the development of capable ones. And she said the seniority adjustment and the retroactive pay recalculation were not optional and were not slow, and she expected the paperwork to be complete before Salinas landed back in Chicago. Arthur was writing throughout all of this. She could hear his pen, the specific rhythm of someone taking notes fast and trying not to fall behind. And when she finished, he said, "Yes, ma'am," in the voice of a man who has been reorganized around a purpose that he recognizes as correct and is grateful for, which is the best possible thing a VP of operations can become, and is not always what they become. One final thing she told him: she wanted Valor's entire complaint and resolution history for all senior crew, not just Whitmore, all senior crew across all hubs for the past 10 years, audited against the rates of no-action resolutions with the managers who signed off on each no-action resolution, identified by name, and a cross-reference built to see whether there were other Phil Greers in the system who had not yet been found. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's going to be a very large audit." Naomi said, "I know. Start today." Robert Ashby was the kind of man who had been in rooms where large consequential things were decided for long enough that he had developed the particular composure of someone who has learned to lead with control rather than emotion. And the fact that his control was fraying at the edges when Naomi's call connected was itself information. It meant that the situation had exceeded his threshold of manageable, which was a threshold that Naomi had gathered from the 112 slides, and the prior CEO's 3 failed strategic pivots was set somewhat higher than it perhaps should have been. He led with the stock. Down 11%, he said, as though Naomi might not have heard, as though the information itself might be the thing that reorganized her priorities. He told her the union was already filing for an emergency labor injunction to stay the termination pending arbitration. He told her that 3 of Valor's top institutional investors had called his personal cell phone before 6 a.m., which had not happened in 7 years. And then he said, "You've been CEO for 3 days, and you've started a war." Naomi sat with that for a moment, not because she was formulating a response, but because she wanted to let him finish saying what he needed to say, because Robert Ashby was not a bad man and the fear in his voice was real and it deserved to be heard before it was addressed. Then she said, "Good morning, Robert, and let me tell you what I see from here." She told him about the stock 11% down in pre-market was a fear reaction to an incomplete story, the story of an airline that had harassed a passenger, and that story was true and deserved the market's reaction. The story that would follow it, the story of an airline that identified the problem, fired the perpetrator, and had a CEO who was willing to say so on the record, in her own voice, was a different story. And she was releasing it in 90 minutes, and she expected it to move the market in the other direction by end of day. She told him about the union. The union was filing to protect a man who had racially demeaned a passenger on camera in front of 7 recording devices. She was asking Robert Ashby very specifically whether he thought that was a fight the union could win in public. She told him about the investors. 3 calls before 6 a.m. meant 3 investors who were watching, which was different from 3 investors who were abandoning, and investors who are watching are investors who believe the situation is being managed, and she intended to give them evidence that it was. And then she told him what she had actually found. Not the incident, but the infrastructure beneath the incident. Phil Greer and his decade of buried complaints, the 3 women who had filed and been reassigned, Camille, who had resigned rather than stay in a system that had told her the cost of speaking up was her career, the union structure that had made accountability structurally expensive, the management layers above Greer that had looked away because looking away was rewarded. She said, "You hired me to cut the rot. I found it. I found exactly where it lives, and exactly who has been protecting it, and exactly what it has cost the people inside this company who tried to name it and were punished for naming it. The question is not whether we deal with it. It has already been dealt with on camera in front of 4.7 million people and counting. The question is whether we tell the truth about it or we hide from it, and I am not built for hiding." The silence on the other end of the line was the silence of a man recalculating. He said finally, "I trust you. Fix it." She said the fixing started at 7:09 a.m. at Gate K7 this morning. Everything after this is reconstruction. She heard him let out a breath that contained, she thought, a great deal. 7 years of incremental decline and 3 failed strategic pivots, and the particular exhaustion of a man who has been running a company whose fundamental problem he has not been able to name, and who has just been told the name. She hung up. The coffee beside her was completely cold. She looked at the television screen on the wall of the lounge where a news anchor was describing the incident at Gate K7 above a split image, Whitmore on the left, her own face on the right, and between them the number that kept changing upward as she watched. 5.1 million views. She picked up the cold coffee. She drank it anyway. The carpet at Gate K7 had been replaced. It was a small thing, standard-grade commercial carpet in a deep blue-gray that would not show wear for several years, and Naomi noticed it on a Tuesday morning 6 months after Flight 208, because she always noticed K7. Always looked at it when she came through Chicago O'Hare, which was often because she still flew commercial and she still flew Valor, and she still, when the routing allowed it, departed from this terminal. She was not auditing this morning. She was catching a 7:45 to Dallas for a board presentation, and she was early because she was always early, and she stood for a moment near the windows where she had sat in a standard airport chair on a different Tuesday morning and watched the front line collapsing, and she saw instead 2 agents on duty at the gate podium. The delay board, current and accurate, a clean Valor kiosk with a working screen, and a PA system that, when the morning gate agent tested it at 7:02, produced a clear and undistorted sound that carried to the back of the boarding area without anyone having to ask what was said. Priya Anand was one of the 2 agents on duty. She looked up when she saw Naomi, and something passed between them. Not warmth, exactly. Not yet, the easy warmth of people who have moved entirely through something difficult together, but a recognition that carried weight. The specific recognition of 2 people who know what the other cost them and have not yet fully reckoned with the account, but are trying, and the trying is visible and real. Priya had spent the 6 months since administrative leave co-authoring with Valor's newly restructured employee welfare team, the gate agent intervention protocol that had gone live across all 23 hubs 4 weeks earlier. A practical, detailed, non-theoretical guide to what a gate agent actually does when a crew member or passenger situation escalates beyond the scope of standard procedure, including specific language, specific escalation chains, specific documentation requirements, and a specific and direct statement that gate agents who follow the protocol will be supported by management rather than left alone in the middle of an impossible choice. The module had been downloaded 4,200 times in its first 3 weeks. A version had been requested by 2 other airlines. Priya had written most of it herself in the evenings after her shift in the particular focused manner of someone who is doing reparative work and understanding it as such. Naomi nodded at her. Priya nodded back. That was enough. Her phone buzzed as she settled into her seat at the gate, a message from Camille Osei, who had returned to Valor 3 months ago in a role she had helped design chair of the Valor Crew Welfare Review Committee, a body with actual authority to investigate, escalate, and if necessary override management decisions about crew complaints with a reporting line directly to the CEO and a quarterly public disclosure requirement that meant its findings could not be quietly filed and forgotten. Camille's message was brief in the manner of someone who has learned to say what she means without spending more words on it than necessary boarding a Rome flight. "Thought you'd want to know I'm still here." Naomi read it twice. Then she typed back 3 words. "Good. Keep going." From the gate to her right, K11, she could read it from where she sat. A PA chimed and a familiar voice filled the corridor. Captain Ray Salinas was announcing his departure at 7:40 to Miami, and his voice had the settled, unhurried authority of someone who has been doing a thing long enough that it has become simply who they are. The slight nervousness of that first announcement entirely gone, replaced by the particular ease of competence that has had time to become habitual. She listened for the length of the announcement, which was not long, and then she looked out the terminal window at the aircraft lined up at the gates. Valor planes, blue and white, early morning light touching the nose cones, and she let herself have a moment with what she had made, because she had been taught by people who understood the nature of the work that you have to let yourself see what you have built, or the building becomes only about the next thing and the next thing and the next, and you lose the reason you were building in the first place. Phil Greer had been terminated 4 months ago, along with 2 other regional managers whose complaint resolution records had not survived the accountability review. A review that had taken 11 weeks, involved a team of 12 people, produced a 340-page document, and resulted in the restructuring of Valor's entire internal reporting infrastructure in ways that made the protection of conduct like Whitmore's not simply wrong, but operationally impossible to sustain. The union had contested Greer's termination. The 340-page document had made the contest brief. Derek Whitmore's airline transport pilot license had been permanently revoked by the FAA 3 months ago following an investigation that had been formally initiated by Naomi, who had filed the complaint not on the grounds of discrimination, though the discrimination was documented and unambiguous, but on the grounds of demonstrated inability to separate personal bias from safety judgment, which made him, she had argued in the formal complaint, a risk to any aircraft he commanded. The FAA investigation had agreed. He was done not just at Valor, but everywhere, the only industry in which he had ever worked, and the particular identity he had worn for 27 years. The 4 gold stripes and the pilot and command authority, and the sense of absolute dominion over whoever was on his aircraft was no longer available to him. She did not think about him often. When she did, it was not with satisfaction she had too much to build, for satisfaction to be the dominant note, and the harm he had done was real and had outlasted him and would continue to require repair that satisfaction could not contribute to. She thought about the people he had harmed instead. She thought about Camille, who was boarding a flight to Rome. She thought about the flight attendants who had come back to work, and the ones who had not yet, and she thought about the work of rebuilding the thing that had been broken in them, which was trust, not trust in a company, but trust in the idea that speaking up is not the same as being destroyed. Naomi looked down at her left wrist at her mother's watch, the thin gold band worn smooth by decades of a wrist that was not hers, and then decades of her own. Her mother had taken a different airline, had learned through the network of women who pass such knowledge between themselves in the quiet registers that institutions don't hear that Valor was not safe for them, not in the way that they needed a thing to be safe in order to give it their money and their time and their trust. The watch was warm against her skin. It was always warm. The boarding call for her Dallas flight came over the K7P, a clear and undistorted exactly as it should be, and she stood, picked up her carry-on, and joined the boarding line. She opened her notebook on the aircraft after the door had closed and the city had begun to fall away below them, and she turned to a page she had left blank 6 months ago for something she had not yet been ready to write, and she began. The seat you occupy has a history. So does the seat next to you. So does every seat on this plane. Every person who sat here before you paid for the right to be treated as a passenger. Not a problem, not a question, not a disruption, just a person who bought a ticket and deserves to arrive. That is not a high standard. It is the only standard, and it is what we owe each other. This is the new Valor. Welcome aboard. The plane climbed through the low clouds over Chicago and broke into the clear sky above. And the light that came through the window was very bright and very clean, and below her the city spread out in every direction, ordinary and immense, full of people who had places to go and things to do, and lives that were organized around the assumption that a valid ticket is a promise that will be kept. She was going to keep it. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us tell more stories about courage, justice, and the people who refuse to be made small. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done standing in that boarding line?